If you've watched any home renovation show lately, you've probably noticed a common theme. Walls come tumbling down, and suddenly the kitchen, dining area, and living room merge into one big happy family zone. This open concept floor plan, where one great room combines what used to be separate spaces, has become the go to style in American homes. It's hard to imagine it any other way now, but not so long ago, houses were a maze of small, distinct rooms, each with a specific purpose and plenty of walls and doors in between. So, how on earth did we get from there to here? Hi everyone, Ken here. Hit that subscribe button and let's explore this house. To understand why today's homes embrace wide open spaces, we need to step back in time and peek into the houses of the past when having a separate formal dining room and a door to hide the messy kitchen was simply how things were done. It turns out there were some very practical reasons older homes were divided into lots of smaller rooms. For one, keeping warm was a constant concern. Before modern central heating, each room often had its own fireplace or stove, so spaces were kept small and closed off to contain heat. If you lived in the 1800s, for example, you wanted those cozy parlor doors shut tight on a winter night. In summer, too, having separate rooms with strategically placed windows helped control airflow and keep the house cooler in the days before air conditioning. In short, walls and doors were early climate control tools. Another reason for all those walls was privacy and social formality. In Victorian times, society was more formal, and homes reflected that. There was often an elaborate front entry hall with a parlor to receive guests, separate from the family's private rooms. Each space had a distinct function and social etiquette attached to it. Dining rooms, for example, were strictly for meals, and it would be unthinkable to see the kitchen mess from the dining table. Speaking of kitchens, they were purposefully tucked away in the back of the house or even in a separate wing. But why was this? Well, for wealthier families, the kitchen was the domain of servants or hired cooks, and it wasn't a place to show off to guests. Cooking was a messy, noisy affair with wood-fired ovens, so the kitchen had a door to keep smells and commotion away from the polite areas of the home. Essentially, 100 plus years ago, the ideal was to hide the work. Food magically appeared from a hidden kitchen, and entertaining took place in designated, spotless rooms like the parlor or formal dining room. Social class divisions were literally built into the floor plans. Large Victorian houses often had back staircases for staff and butler's pantries as buffers between the kitchen and dining rooms. Life at home was compartmentalized, formal versus informal, public versus private, family versus servants. And the architecture reinforced those boundaries with plenty of walls. Lastly, we can't forget about structural limits. Early construction technology made it hard, but not impossible to span large open spaces. Most houses were built with wood framing that could only handle modest room sizes unless you had thick support walls or posts. Before steel beams and engineered lumber, those interior walls often had to be there to hold up the second floor or roof. So historically, a house was by necessity a collection of smaller boxes. It was just how you built a sturdy home with the materials available. All told, old houses weren't chopped up by accident. It made technical and cultural sense at the time. Even while Victorian homeowners were happily compartmentalizing their lives, a few forward-thinking architects started asking, do we really need all these walls? In the late 1800s, some designers experimented with more flowing layouts. For instance, American architect Henry Hobson Richardson is credited with an early stab at an open-ish floor plan. His hay and pane houses, built in 1886, featured a living room that opened into the dining room, creating a partial sense of one larger space. This was unusual for the time. Imagine two rooms connected by a wide archway instead of a door. A number of shingle-style and early arts and crafts homes around the turn of the century followed suit, swapping out small parlors for larger rooms or double parlors connected by big openings. These were baby steps toward the open concept, even if kitchens and other areas were still kept separate. The true pioneer who blew the idea of separate rooms wide open was Frank Lloyd Wright. If you've heard that name, you know he's a giant of modern architecture, and he basically gave birth to the open floor plan as we know it. As early as 1901, Wright was drawing house plans that ditched the traditional warren of rooms. In a Ladies' Home Journal issue that year, he published a design for a home in a prairie town, showcasing a ground floor where the living room and dining room flowed together as one continuous space. This was radical stuff at the time. In that 1901 plan, the only thing separating the living and dining areas was a broad arch and a central fireplace, effectively uniting them into one big hall. Wright was consciously trying to simplify homes. He said he wanted to reduce the rooms in a house to the barest essentials and have those spaces be free-flowing, often with an eye to connecting the indoors to the outdoors. Long low roofs with wide eaves, rows of windows, and open interiors defined a style, a far cry from the boxy Victorian layout. Of course, even Wright had to compromise at first. In that early prairie house concept, the kitchen was still shoved in a corner, semi-hidden, with the assumption that servants would handle the cooking out of sight. But he was already questioning that norm. In the following years, Wright published other designs in which he shrunk the butler's pantry and opened the kitchen up a bit more to the rest of the house. Little by little, he was chipping away at the idea that the person preparing food must be isolated from guests. This was revolutionary. It hinted that the kitchen might someday be treated as a social space rather than a strictly utilitarian one. In Europe, around the same time, architects like Le Corbusier were developing the idea of the free plan, enabled by new construction techniques, like using concrete and steel structures that could open up rooms and free up interior layouts. Le Corbusier's famous 5 points of architecture in 1920s France included the concept that interior walls were no longer structural. You could place them or not place them however you wanted. This set the stage for more open residential designs too, and in California, brothers Charles and Henry Green were designing open-plan bungalows in the early 1900s, and later modernists like Rudolf Schindler and Richard Neutra created houses with flowing indoor-outdoor spaces and minimal interior divisions. The idea of openness was in the air among avant-garde architects of the early 20th century. Still, for all these trailblazers, the average home in 1920 was not an open-concept wonderland. Wright's open prairie houses were mostly custom projects for wealthy clients, and traditional closed floor plans still had a huge head start on public acceptance. Many people weren't ready to give up their formal dining room or embrace a visible kitchen. In fact, some of Wright's own clients demanded he include more walls or separate spaces because his free-flow ideas felt too unconventional. Change was happening, but slowly. It would take some major societal shifts and a world war to bring open-concept living from a rare luxury to the mainstream. What really helped swing the pendulum toward open layouts were the technological advancements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries combined with evolving lifestyles. Think of it as the stage being set for walls to come down. One huge factor was heating and cooling technology. As mentioned, early houses needed to stay warm, but by the turn of the 20th century, central heating, like furnaces with radiators in each room and later forced air systems, became more common. Suddenly, you didn't need a fireplace every 20 feet. A furnace in the basement could heat a whole floor through vents or pipes, so homeowners could afford to have larger rooms and still keep it cozy. The same goes for cooling. Once electric fans and eventually air conditioning arrived, architects weren't as constrained by the need for small rooms with cross-ventilating windows. By the early 20th century, Victorian formality was fading. Society was becoming less prude and a bit more relaxed about some customs. Economic changes around the 1920s and 1930s also meant houses on average got smaller while families might have been growing. You suddenly had more kids running around in less space. Those stately parlors and separate dining rooms started to look impractical. In many modest homes, one room had to serve multiple functions, dining, homework, play, etc., because there simply wasn't space for a dedicated room for each activity. Thus, the idea of a multi-purpose room wasn't just stylish or modern thinking, it was a necessity for a lot of families. Having a combined living dining area or eating kitchen made a lot of sense to maximize space. Basically, by mid-century, the stage was set, technology allowed it, economics encouraged it, and a new generation was open to living more informally in their homes. All that remained was to popularize the concept, and that was exactly what happened next. After World War II, America underwent a housing boom like never before. Millions of new homes sprang up in suburban developments, and the lifestyle of the American family was evolving. This was the era where the open floor plan really began to take hold in everyday houses. Families had been held apart by the war, and when those soldiers returned home, they couldn't care less about pretense and were ready to trade formality for family. It's around this time we see the concept of the open kitchen emerge in popular design. In many mid-century house plans, the kitchen opened to a den or family room or had a large pass-through window or breakfast bar connecting it to the dining area, rather than being completely closed off. This was a huge break from the past. No longer was the kitchen a strictly utilitarian, hide-the-mess zone, it was becoming the heart of the home, a place where the family and even guests might gather. Post-war builders and developers took these ideas and ran with them. In the 1950s and 1960s, you start seeing many ranch-style houses and split-level homes with L-shaped living, dining rooms, or family rooms adjacent to open kitchens. On the West Coast, developer Joseph Eichler made a name building modern tract homes inspired by high-end architects. Eichler homes were famous for their open plan layouts, huge glass walls, post and beam construction, and a combined living dining space often open to the kitchen. They were middle-class homes that embraced features like radiant floor heating so they could disperse with radiators and have clean, open ceilings and lots of glass. Meanwhile, across the US, the notion of the great room was beginning to surface. This term usually meant one large central room that served as the primary gathering space for the family, essentially a living room combined with a casual dining area, often adjacent to an open kitchen. By the 1970s, a lot of new houses, especially more contemporary styles, featured a great room with a vaulted ceiling and maybe a loft or open staircase, emphasizing the spacious feel. Even more traditional homes in the 1980s started quietly dropping walls. A typical 1980s suburban two-story might still have a formal dining room, but it became common for the kitchen to open to a den or family room where the TV lived. The message was clear. The action in the home was in these open, shared spaces, rather than in a stuffy parlor. By the 1990s, the trend had reached a tipping point. Open concept was now the default for new construction. Home builders found that buyers overwhelmingly wanted that big kitchen, family great room combo, and many older homes were being remodeled to knock out walls and create it if it wasn't already there. Walk into a newer home today, and you'll likely find a light-filled expanse where the kitchen, dining, and living functions all blend together. It's easy to forget that this would have seemed strange a century ago. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. What do you think about open concept living? Do you prefer a bunch of smaller rooms, or are you happy with the current trends? Let me know down below in the comments section, and while you're there, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an exciting episode of This House.